Good morning. Thank you very much. I want to reiterate the thanks to ICT and for Amichai for convening this session and talking about NATO. I decided to take a more focused perspective on the Mediterranean and the Middle East, something that I've been following for quite some years. And I just want to make a few introductory remarks. Something I also mentioned to students. Eulogies about NATO have been delivered since the 1950s. Criticism regarding burden sharing are also from back in the 1950s. People should, ought to remember that the debate over nuclear strategy in Europe in the 1960s was much about a burden sharing debate when the Europeans tried to resist the American desire to shift from massive retaliation to flexible response. So, bearing that in mind, and it's important before I set out my critique of NATO, having said, listening to all the criticism, which is all very valid, I would not dismiss NATO because at the end of the day, this is one of the, I think my take-home message from here is, as an institution, at the European, global level, and also at the Middle East level, NATO is a unique platform. It offers tools that no other institution could offer. The problem, however, is that today, particularly, the issue is different perspectives, mildly put, between allies. At one time, we also had an issue with partners in the Middle East, but today that is less of a problem. And if you want to understand why I say it's less of a problem, you can very easily look at the annual meeting of chiefs of defense of NATO with the Mediterranean dialogue counterparts. Once upon a time, I would say politely, not the highest level ranking officers showed up for this meeting with their equivalents from the North Atlantic Alliance. Today, at least in recent years, the level of representation from the Mediterranean side at these Chief of Defense meetings has grown up increasingly. Nobody would have expected the Chief of Defense of Egypt to show up for those meetings a few years ago. So today there is an interest on part of the Middle East and of the Mediterranean. The issue is different perspectives when it comes to the Allies. Now, everybody mentioned several anniversaries. I'll do the same, and I'll add one or two. It's been mentioned that we are marking this year 25 years to the Mediterranean dialogue, but I think more importantly, this year we also mark 15 years to the NATO Istanbul summit, because that summit and its position and the decision to hold it in Istanbul at a time when Turkey was seen, Erdogan's Turkey, was seen as a bridge between the West and the Middle East. And for those who forget, President Bush standing near the Bosphorus, urging Europeans to have to admit Turkey into the EU. It sounds like a different time, but that also marked the shift of interest of the alliance to the Middle East, broadly defined. Also, Afghanistan, NATO's involvement in Afghanistan starts only thereafter. For those who forget, NATO wasn't in from the very beginning. The Mediterranean dialogue was upgraded there. The ICI, which became the cooperation framework with Gulf countries, not all of them, started then. And again, this also, of course, followed the point where it's worth, Amichai has mentioned it, 15 years ago, or 18 years ago, sorry, we experienced September 11. But from a NATO perspective, tomorrow, 18 years ago, NATO invoked for the first and only time Article 5 in response to September 11. And this marked the point where NATO became increasingly concerned about what's going on in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. The only problem was that it never succeeded to define a role for this. Now, part of it has to do with the fact that when the Allies and when the West came to deal with the Middle East, they wanted to fix the Middle East, get it, cure it, if you wish. There's a broad agenda in the early 2000s, Greater Middle East, broader Middle East. Don't want to get into the details, but one of the challenges from NATO's perspective was that when you look at that agenda, when you understand the challenges of the Middle East, and Benedetto referred to it in a different way, NATO's contribution, potential contribution to solve or fix the Middle East were rather limited. But even with its limited toolbox, it tried to, it treated very cautiously, some would say overly cautiously, was even inhibited to engage in the Middle East. And one of the clearest examples for this was in 2006 during the Second Lebanese War, where it was when Israeli officials started raising the idea, which of course the moment the Israelis raised it was dead in the water, but Israelis raised the proposal that it would be a NATO force that would take over UNIFIL. To which the responses from Europe were not very, I would say, encouraging. Some were saying, no, NATO cannot do that. It would look like the Crusaders are coming to the back to the Middle East. But, and that has been something that has been an inhibiting factor when it comes to the Middle East. And of course, you also have to understand that there were different strategic priorities and perspectives. First of all, when Americans think about the Middle East for them starts more or less in strategic terms, geostrategic terms, if to follow Jan's remarks. They start somewhere in Egypt and go to eastwards towards Iran and the Gulf. When you ask Europe to focus on Middle East and preferred Mediterranean, it starts, of course, with Morocco to the west, and then somewhere with Jordan, Israel, somewhere in between. So, in that respect, there is a difference between the geopolitical perspectives. But not less so, the issue came, of course, there was a very critical issue, and that was the war in Iraq in 2003 that created a huge crisis within the alliance. And notably, it also had an impact on NATO's operations in Afghanistan. Because, to be honest, allies were reluctant to commit forces to Afghanistan because they thought that that would enable the United States to divert forces to Iraq, to which they opposed. And that's just to show some of the problems that NATO had to deal with in the Middle East. And of course, there was also, at first, some limited interest in the MD and ICI countries. And towards the end of the 2000s, we had now also the issue of the Turkish factor. Now, the Turkish factor at first was only directed towards Israel after the Mavi Marmara, but because of that, it also inhibited NATO's partnerships across the Middle East. And today, it inhibits other cooperation framework. It also inhibits other issues. For instance, to be blunt, and since I'm allowed to be, it also has an impact on Egypt's engagement. Now, the outcome of all this was that NATO had no real strategic concept of its role in the Middle East. And the Mediterranean dialogue, once there were a political crisis between Israel and the Arab countries at the end of the 2000s, only increased. There was hardly any political dimension to the Mediterranean dialogue. There were no more ministerial meetings after 2009. And it was not clear what NATO would do in the region. NATO's main core activity became public diplomacy, which in itself is important, and I admit that it is a major role. Takes up a major part of NATO's operations, even among its allies. To some extent, it's something that NATO is very, very conscious about. It has good aspects, bad aspects, but that's the face of thing. Now, when the turmoil hits the Middle East, and particularly after the rise of ISIS, you can see that largely NATO is MIA. Honestly, that's the story. There is an exception to this rule, and that was NATO's intervention in Libya, Operation Unified Protector. And it was a remarkable operation, not because of its results, which can be debated, and that's besides the point for a moment, but it was for the first time that NATO operated, deployed military assets, and used force in the Middle East, and Northern Africa for that matter, alongside three NATO partners from the Middle East that also used force under NATO command. And I'm referring to Jordan, Qatar, and UAE. And that, by the way, should have put to bed all the European hesitations about deploying forces in the Middle East and how it would be viewed as crusaders and all that thing. Well, it didn't. Now, of course, when we consider, and this has been mentioned also by Benedetta and by Jan and by Ariel, US priorities have shifted. Yes, Europe is less important. From a strategic point of view, I think actually there's some good things about that. It's not all bad. But the same goes for the Middle East. Now, when ISIS rises and there's this new global coalition, NATO is not invited to lead it. Yes, there were discussions that weren't published, I would say towards the end of the Obama administration, about, yes, handing over the lead of the global coalition to NATO. To a large extent, and it's important to understand this, NATO was involved in the global coalition. NATO assets were deployed. Most of the partners in the global coalition are NATO allies. Most of the assets were coming from NATO, and some of the meetings were even held at NATO headquarters. So it was there, there but not there. But, and shockingly enough, also when it comes to the recent Gulf crisis, NATO is absent. Even the Secretary General went on record saying that nobody has asked NATO to be involved. When I'm talking about the discussions about a coalition to protect, to uphold freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. Now, and that is remarkable given the fact that actually NATO does have a platform, a tool, a framework for those kinds of operations. It's called Sea Guardian. Operation Sea Guardian today only operates in the Mediterranean. And it carries out only 3 of the 7 missions it has defined. In the Mediterranean, it only does situational awareness, counter-terrorism, and the wonderful term which I love, capacity building, which I might return to if Amichai allows me. Only 3 missions it operates in the Mediterranean. By the way, God forbid not around the year, but only 3 weeks every 2 months. Rest of the time, I guess we can do without that. But Sea Guardian as a framework has 4 other missions, optional, which NAC, the North Atlantic Council, can decide to apply. And those are, shockingly enough, uphold freedom of navigation, maintain interdiction, fight WMD proliferation, and protect critical infrastructure. Now, this is a tool. Now, the whole debate about the global coalition for the Gulf would have been much more easier within a NATO framework, because then you don't have to talk about rules of engagement, command, and all those things, because you have the thing ready. But it's more has to do with the politics among allies than anything else. And that's the issue today. So how does NATO, which is committed to projecting stability to its southern flank or to the south, what does it do? Well, it has talked about training local forces, but now it's called differently, so it's better. It's called defense capacity building. It does see Guardian less than half of the time and half of the missions. And it has established this wonderful thing called NATO Strategic Direction South, or known also as the Southern Hub, which operates out of the Joint Command in Naples. Now, what is the hub? Because I've always tried to figure out what this means. But if you go onto their website, it will tell you that it is an exciting forum, I'm quoting this word by word, trust me, not inventing it, to connect allies and partners. Now, it's essentially a sort of a think tank, a meeting place. I think NATO could do other things in the Middle East. For instance, the maritime issue for which it's designed. And to do this in 1 second. So essentially, yes, NATO does have enduring relevance in the region. And my criticism comes from the point where I think that NATO could do more. And there's more interest in the region for doing so. And notably, and I think also, having NATO more engaged in the Middle East could do a lot for intra-alliance dialogue. Because the United States, with its focus on China, and Europe really is not positioned to help in that fight, at least not in the strategic defense area. But if NATO would do more to deal with challenges from the Middle East, that would be a contribution that if even the Americans, I'm not sure about Trump, but the Americans at large, could appreciate and find meaningful. I'll stop here.